Oh.
We'll give some people some time to join.
Yep.
I like that little animation.
I think it lets you back.
All right. So great. I see people are starting to join. We'll give them a few more minutes before we get started. Great. Should be a good turnout today. All right. Do you guys see the webinar presentation?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Great. Great. So let's get this started. I want to welcome everyone to the webinar today for data testing and overcoming the automation challenges of data testing. We're going to go through quite a bit of material today, a lot of good anecdotes, a lot of good stories, very, very interesting information. Going to start off with a quick presentation of ourselves, the current situation, some difficulties in the industry, what we're seeing most at the moment, and a little bit about commercial solutions. So say hi to everyone. My name is Albert Reyes. I am the Technical Account Manager at SQALogic. I've been working in the IT field for a little bit over 15 years now. I've managed several accounts in my career, specialized in incident management and security. And I've dabbled a little bit into the infrastructure, hardware, and networking worlds as well. Eric, would you like to present yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Albert. My name is Eric Smythe. I'm the Director of Partner Alliances at RTTS. I have more than 20 years in the IT field, all exclusively on software testing and software quality. My early years at RTTS, I spent as a test engineer, where I was implementing automation for functional testing. From there, I transitioned to managing the RTTS training department, where I delivered classes around various different technologies, around functional test automation and test management solutions. Probably delivered hundreds of classes for hundreds of companies during that time. And then my last 3 years within the organization, I've transitioned to managing the partner program for our QuerySurge product. And my main responsibilities there are to train and help enable our partners to deliver services around the QuerySurge product.
Great, thank you. And Rashad.
Good day, everyone. My name is Rashad Evans. I am the Director of Product Support for QuerySurge. I've been around the IT field for about 15 years, a little bit more than that, but quite some time. Working with RTTS, I started off as a test engineer. I delved into the performance division and headed up the performance division for several years as well. Ran multiple projects amongst the performance division. I've also done several projects in the data testing area. I have some expertise in functional automation. And as I mentioned, I'm currently heading up the support division for QuerySurge.
Great, thanks, Rashad. Let me talk about SQALogic a little bit. So we were founded about 8 years ago. Our CEO has been around for many, many years, over 20 years in the industry, in quality assurance specifically. We are a network of quality assurance experts made up of external consultants and personal relationships that we've built over the years to work cooperatively to achieve a common goal. By validating the quality assurance community, we ensure that we deliver the latest of industry best practices and methodologies. Our specialists are strategically placed on mandates within our clients' quality assurance teams, and that ensures that you get the best experience with the specialists that are geared up for your projects and for the specific mandates. Eric?
Sure, let me talk a little bit about who we are. Both Rashad and I work for RTTS. We position ourselves as the pure play QA and testing organization that specializes in test automation. We're both headquartered out of our New York City office. Over that time, since '96, we've had over 1,000 different engagements that we've worked on, hundreds of different customers. And our focus has always been software testing, software quality. Specifically on the automation side, we've done a lot of functional and performance testing, test automation, but we've also been involved more recently in more data testing projects. And those data testing projects is essentially what led to the development of QuerySurge. And QuerySurge is our software division of RTTS. It's our solution for testing data warehouses, big data, BI products. We're going to talk a little bit about that later and how it addresses some of the challenges that people are seeing around data testing and trying to automate those tasks.
Great. All right, well, let's start this off. Why does data testing matter, especially to the executives in your companies, and how can you address this? How can you make it important to your executives? How can you make them notice that this is something that has value and that you can move forward with? This webinar is going to be a lot of questions and answers. So Eric, to start that off, how does data testing roll up to the executive level?
Sure, great question, Albert. So we know that high-level executives are making critical business decisions based off of their BI and analytics reports. So they're getting this data that's being fed into these reports, and that's critical to determining different decisions that they're going to undertake. Maybe how much inventory that they need to have within different warehouses, or apply to pretty much any different industry. So, of course, the challenge is how accurate and how valid is that data that's being populated into those reports. It's not as straightforward as an application where if something doesn't display properly, it's very apparent that there's a problem. With data testing, or with, I should say, data in general, there could be an issue and it may not show up because everything's working right in the UI of whatever visualization you're viewing it through, but the underlying data could have problems. And one of the reasons for that is that from the time the data is created to the time it actually shows up in those reports that the high-level executives are viewing, that data may be touching many, many different systems and architectures in the organization. It may be transformed, aggregated several different times through several different processes. And it's very easy for a defect or bad data to be introduced into that system. And again, the challenge is it's not easy to detect when there's a problem.
Yeah.
The only time it's going to kind of be easily detected is if somebody makes a decision based on bad data that they didn't know was bad at the time, and then it comes back to them and becomes a huge problem for the organization. So from an executive standpoint, that's what their concern is, and that's what we're usually trying to address. We want to make sure that the data that's being fed into the analytics that they're viewing is accurate. And what are the, what we're going to talk about are some of the best practices. How do we ensure that? How do we go about that? What are the different tools to implement
methodologies,
and the methodologies and everything else.
Perfect. And there's a great, I believe there's a great quote on Gartner. The average organization loses what, 8.2 million annually through poor data quality testing.
Yeah, so you can see how much of an issue it is. And as more and more data is being consumed and absorbed into these organizations, those data problems are just going to only be compacted if they don't have a great strategy for approaching how they're going to test it.
Good stuff. Now, marketplaces. Most of the items that we're going to discuss today are based upon these marketplaces. The key items to note here are all these marketplaces are growing. To whoever wants to take the ball, what are the markets where data testing and data testing automation are most prevalent at the moment?
Well, in terms of markets, what you see here are the different spaces within organizations where data testing is starting to become prevalent. It's kind of a story, right? So it started in the data warehouse marketplace, where most organizations had their data warehouses where they were consuming data and trying to make decisions off of that. But then it kind of migrated to big data. Big data kind of took the place of a lot of on-prem kind of situations, and the big data marketplace also consumes all of this data. So how do you validate that data? You got to test it. And I think it migrated from big data into the last two, right? The analytics and the business intelligence marketplace. Obviously, the data is only consumed and validated because you need to make good business decisions, and you use those BI tools to make those business decisions at the C-suite level. And Obviously, data ops or DevOps is sort of the new kind of term or new kid on the block, where not so much for software development, but more for data development. And so a lot of people are now trying to incorporate their DevOps workflows utilizing their data and creating a space called data ops.
That's great for me. I've never actually heard that term before. Very
yeah, I think we made it up.
All right, so some of the difficulties that are being faced by these organizations within this industry are as follows: the huge data volume and complexity, selecting a proper testing approach, lack of technical expertise, we've all seen that, high upfront investment, how much the company is willing and has sunk into these technologies and methodologies, incomplete requirements, selecting the right tool, and implementation tools, which we're going to get to speak a little bit more about later. Eric, how does the data volume play into this challenge?
Yeah, so I think the challenge that organizations are running into is, customers are starting to process millions of records, sometimes per day, sometimes per hour. And that data is being, again, put into these architectures that are progressing through the system. So the challenge is, how do we come up with a good strategy for testing this data at such large volumes? Obviously, when it's a smaller data set, it's something that's much easier to manage, much easier to address. But as the data sets get larger and larger, as organizations are, consuming more data and trying to implement that data into their strategies, testing the large volume and making sure you have the coverage of all the different variations of data becomes a bigger problem. I think one of the things you can see is, as one of the hot topics now is Internet of Things, right? Where your refrigerator is polling back to some center and giving information about, how often you're opening the door per day and how long is it open for. All these different devices are now feeding information. So all this data is being collected by these organizations. So the only way for them to make sense of it is to, again, push it through some type of process where it eventually ends up into those analytics and BI reports. And taking all that data, making sense of it, and making sure it's accurate is where the challenge comes in. So the larger the volume becomes, the more teams are starting to struggle with an approach. There's just so much. How do we deal with all this data that we're starting to consume?
Very good point. Rashad, how often is having incomplete requirements a problem?
Well, it happens more often than you would think. A lot of organizations are used to gathering requirements for their functional automation or their functional testing requirements, or even their performance testing requirements. But for data testing, it's a little bit different because it requires a lot of esoteric knowledge about not only the data, but about the business that's using the data as well. A lot of people need to understand the different source systems from which these data points are coming from. So if you have all of these source databases, flat files, things of that nature, you need to know those source systems, what the data looks like, how it's formatted, and how we can consume the data in order for it to make sense. They also need to understand the downstream systems, right? Once we get this data, where do we load it? We load it into our data warehouses. We load it into our data marts. We're analyzing it with our BI tools. And then finally, just compiling all of this information from all of these different source systems and the requirements about them, how to transform the data, is a huge challenge because it requires a lot of people who have the individual knowledge for these different spaces. So most organizations that we see out there do have a deficit of requirements when starting their data testing initiatives. And that's one of the major challenges in data testing in general.
And that's where automation comes into play, right? Have you guys seen any customers use any particular automation data testing tools in the past to try to come?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, the first tool is no tool, right? They look at their data and they're trying to compare from the source to the target by what we call like a stare and compare. They're visually comparing the data on the source and the target. But then, people get smarter about it and they want to use tools like Excel, which are readily available. But Excel has its own challenges. It's slow. It doesn't allow you to do large data sets and things of that nature. And, all of the other things in terms of, just good testing practices. It doesn't allow you to implement that. We've also seen in the industry where people are trying to utilize functional tools like Unified Functional Tester from Micro Focus or Selenium or other functional tools that are in the functional testing automation space. It can help with the automation of the testing, but these tools are not built for that. So they do not have all of the needs or provide all of the needs for the data testing space. So, it's been a challenge, especially earlier on when data was becoming, getting set on fire. This is, it's worth its weight in gold. How do we test this data? The huge challenge that Eric was talking about earlier. What tools do we do it? They were just not on the market space, especially earlier on in the life cycle. Yeah.
And to go back to the implementation issues that you were speaking of, Eric, how do you see organizations conduct data testing today? And do they have any resources with the proper skill sets to accomplish it?
They do. I think, getting the right team together is obviously very important.
Yeah.
What we typically see is a couple different groups of people that are asked to test these types of environments. The first would be maybe your traditional software tester. So the traditional software tester knows how to test applications, knows how to, understand requirements, and knows how to, create test cases to do that. But sometimes they may not have the understanding of data structures that may be needed to do data testing. They may not have the proper SQL knowledge to be able to run the proper queries, to be able to, pull that data back. And sometimes they don't have the knowledge of just how the data is being used, right? So that's another challenge. Like, what does all this data mean and how is it being implemented? In addition to that, you also have other groups where you have people on the business side who understand the data, understand what it's being used for, but they may not understand best testing practices. So that's going to be a challenge for them. And then you have some people who are doing it who maybe, live in the data space, who write really good SQL, but they may not have a testing background. So for them, it's how do I apply that knowledge and adapt it to testing? So I think, people that are doing this kind of fall into those different ranges. And obviously the ideal scenario is to have people that have all those different skill sets that are all working together on the team so that you can roll out and implement your data testing successfully.
Good point. Good point. Rashad, to our second item here, a little bit more on the automation part. How does data test automation differ from traditional functional and performance automation?
Sure. So I think from a functional perspective, most people who've used these tools or just been in the functional space, your objective is to test the application to make sure it's doing what it's spec'd out to do, right? If you're on a website that you can book a hotel room, you want to make sure you can successfully book a hotel room, right? From a performance perspective, you're looking to make sure that the application can withstand the load that's projected at least to be directed its way. And so the requirements are different for functional and performance testing, and they're different for data testing. Your objectives are different. For data testing, you're obviously looking to validate that the data that's coming in from your source systems are being transformed properly when loaded into your target systems. And you're not looking to functionally test it to make sure, there is no functional, there's no UI for data, right? And the skill set, as Eric was mentioned, required for data testing is much different for functional testing. And it's much different for performance testing. Functional testing, you have to understand what the application is trying to do. You have to understand upper and lower bounds of input values and things of that nature. Performance testing, you have to understand, what is your user population going to look like? What are your workflows looking like in performance testing, and how all of those things come together in your peak load periods. Data testing is really just making sure your data can be validated based off of your requirements, so that when the downstream systems are consuming the data, you know you have good data and you can make good business decisions.
Exactly. Yeah, good points. To the third item here, inability to integrate test into data pipelines. Eric, can you talk a little bit about those challenges, the challenges of testing when dealing with pipelines specifically?
Sure. So as I'm sure many people are aware of, DevOps is kind of one of the key buzz terms out there, where people are taking the development of, let's say, traditional software and tying it to the operation side. So the idea is to have these tasks that are automatically kicked off through automation to progress through from the initial code check-in to the deployment of the software to wherever it needs to be delivered. What we're starting to see is people are wanting to take those same approaches and now tie that to their data architecture. So they want to be able to drive as many of these tasks as far as, you know, the transformation of the data, the loading of data into the different systems, the pushing the data to the different views that are eventually going to be fed into these different reports. And they want to be able to push that data and automate the tasks. And specifically, what we're going to be addressing is the testing tasks related to that. So after something gets executed, maybe an ETL job runs that's moving data from one system to the other and transforming that data. Before the next phase of the process, make sure that data is tested. It all came over correctly. The transformation happened the right way. And then we can validate that right on the fly before moving on to the next step. So I think what we're seeing a big push and where organizations are looking to go this year and beyond is they may have instituted some type of data testing already, but they want to know, how can I take that data testing that we're currently doing and apply it in a DevOps, data ops environment, where similar to what organizations have already done with traditional software development.
Good point. It is definitely something that's difficult, and we've been seeing it a lot within the industry lately. So now, to address those, the traditional data testing validation methods. Here are the four key ones, the ones that we see the most often in this industry specifically. Sampling, currently the most used method. Minus queries, well, this query is commonly used to, you know, obtain the differences between the two results, if that's correct. If there's no difference at the end of everything, well, then there's no change. So, you know, you have a successful migration of data. Homegrown, well, in-house solutions that organizations have developed. They have their own potential risks. We'll dive a little bit deeper into those. And the commercial solutions, well, software in the wild, if you will, the software that you can find or purchase from certified vendors. So let's move on to the first methodology. Eric, can you explain a little bit more about what sampling is and how this method is, this method of testing is performed specifically?
Sure. So traditionally, this is probably still how most data testing is done, is the data tester will have a list of requirements, typically referred to as a mapping document or mapping requirements. And what that'll contain is information about the source data store. If it's in a table structure, the tables, the columns that represented in those tables, and what type of data is going to be stored in there. And then as that data is moving through to another system, that system is generally going to be called the target. And that will explain where the data from the source is going. So, you know, what is the target system? What type of database is it? Where in the table structure is it going? Which column is it going to be populated? And in addition to that, it'll also include any type of transformation that may happen to that data. So for instance, you might have in a source system, a single column called full name, which has the person's first and last name. But in your target system, there may be two columns, first name and last name. So if they're going to be moving that data from a source system to a target system, there has to be some transformation on that data to be able to split that data into two columns. It's a very basic example, but those are the types of things that happen when you're going about your typical data test. So what people will do typically is they will take those business requirements and they will query both the source and target system using some type of standard SQL editor. There's a bunch of open source ones out there. A lot of the database vendors have their own that they may be leveraging. And then what they'll do is they'll query both the source and target system, and those queries will return back result sets. And then what they'll do is they'll try to match the result sets up to say, hey, based on my rules and based on my requirements, did the source data on my left side correspond to what I'm expecting to see on the right side? Sometimes they'll visualize that and just maybe take a sampling of, let's say, 20 records and say, hey, these 20 records, do they look good? Sometimes they're more strategic about it, where they'll say, look, I need a cross section to try to get maybe 5 or 10 different companies that are in different vertical markets when I'm looking at my data set, so I have a good range of values. But of course, the problem is you're going to have a difficulty scaling in those types of situations.
Yeah, definitely. And Rashad, if you can talk a little bit more about those problems and what are the potential risks of testing through sampling?
Yeah, I mean, sampling is good when you don't have, a suite or a tool to do it for you, but the risks can entail, like, if you're using large data sets, it's impossible to visually compare large data sets. Take, for example, a situation where in a value on the source side, you have a space at the end of that value, but on the target side, you don't have a space on the end of the value. How can you tell visually that those values are different? Right? You can't. So things like that is just impossible to get. Plus the sheer volume of tests. If you're looking to test millions, even thousands of rows of data to visually stare and compare at is a daunting task. So it's just not feasible. It's error prone, right? You are prone to make mistakes, like the example I mentioned with the space at the end of the value on the source side. There's no way that you're going to be able to determine that there's a difference between the source and the target in that kind of situation. And then the data coverage is quite small because you are not in an automated fashion comparing this data. You can only compare so much data, and then you're going to have to do this over and over again as the data gets changed or updated because of defects. Typically what we see out in the field is when people are doing this visually, they're consuming or comparing usually less than 1% of the total data package that they're looking to validate. So you don't have a high confidence that you're going to have good data in your downstream systems.
It's still surprising to me that this is the most used or commonly used method still in the industry.
Yeah, it's surprising to us as well. But it wasn't surprising to us when we started out here because there was really nothing in the space for it. So we experienced what a lot of people are experiencing now, and hopefully there's a better way going forward.
Yeah, and I think, Albert, just to kind of further on that, I think, part of that issue is the subtlety of the data defect, right? It's not in your face. So people aren't seeing like a big error message like they would in an application. So if there's a problem in that process, sometimes it's hard to, get the, management team's focus to say, look, there's a problem here. You're getting bad data, and that bad data is propagating through your system because it's not right in their face. So I think for that reason, the approaches that people take to data testing aren't as stringent as they are to maybe typical software applications.
Good point. Yeah. Moving on to the second method, which is the minus queries. Eric, can you give us a little bit more insight as to how to use the minus query?
Sure. So to address some of the limitations of sampling, right? The biggest one being you can only test so much data. Data testers have then gone to another solution called minus queries. And essentially the concept of a minus query is you're getting those two same result sets that we talked about based off of requirements. You have your results on your data sources, and then you have your result set from your target system. But what they're going to do is to determine if there's any differences, they're going to let the SQL engines do a lot of the work. So essentially they create a query where they say, I'm going to take my source result set and I'm going to subtract that from my target result set. Now, in an ideal scenario, if the data is the exact same between source and target, the result of that minus query should be nothing. They should cancel each other out, saying the data matches exactly. I subtracted 5 minus 5 equals 0. right? Same data, you get no results. What minus queries can catch, though, is when there is a difference, either in the number of records or the values of those records, the result of the minus query will be the difference between the systems. So if I say I want to take my source data and subtract it from my target data, anything that's in the source system that does not reside in the target will be returned from that minus query. So if it's either an additional record or if it's a record that the data mismatches between the other side, that will give you, an indication that there's an error. And then typically with minus queries, you also want to do it in both directions. So not only do you want to subtract the source minus the target, but you're also going to subtract the target minus the source, because same thing, there may be something in the target system that is there that shouldn't be based on the source data. So you're going to run those two queries, those minus queries, source minus target, target minus source, try to determine if there's any differences. And then if you do find differences, of course, do a little deeper investigation into what the problem is.
Exactly. And that's all. That's just common common sense, right? Perfect. Let's see here. And Rashad, lucky you. The issues with minus queries.
Yeah, there are a couple of pitfalls with minus queries, right? So one of the first ones is that if you have duplicate data on either the source or the target side, it can be difficult to catch that with minus queries, because a lot of the times those data items are compressed into one another. So minus queries may not catch the duplicate data. Another item is that it requires that both the source and the target data stores have some sort of a link, right? Because since you're minusing those queries, source minus target, target minus source, they have to be able to link to be able to compare the two data sets.
Yeah.
And if you have disparate database technologies that don't have any natural link, you'll have to implement some sort of DB link or database linking technology behind that to get that to be able to run. And then on top of it, you're running these minus queries on the source and target systems. So they can be very resource intensive in terms of CPU and disk IO and things of that nature, because they're running directly on the source and target systems. So that could also adversely affect any other queries that are running for other systems against your source and target, right? So you're basically consuming cycles, and they can be significant on your source and your target. And then typically minus queries are a little bit slower than you would like, and because of all of the things that we laid out in front. So there are some pitfalls with minus queries. They're much better than stare and compare, right? Or even Excel, but those pitfalls are still items that need to be addressed and are difficult to deal with when using minus queries.
Got it. Third testing validation method, the homegrown solution. Eric, how do you see homegrown solutions implemented in the marketplace?
Sure. So typically when people realize that sampling is limited and they address some of the issues with minus queries, they'll start to develop their own dedicated solution for running their automated data tests. So whether that's writing scripts in Python that then they're loading up into some type of build solution, or whether it's maybe building their own application to design specifically to address the data testing tasks that they have. So this is, again, taking it to that next level, trying to build something to meet the needs of the organization's data testing requirements.
Great. And Rashad, these homegrown solutions, how can they become problematic?
Well, when organizations take on the initiative to try to build their own solution, I would say the biggest problem would be maintenance of that homegrown solution. I mean, these guys are testers, right? They're in the testing organization. And whoever develops this solution for them, they also have to now be cognizant of bugs that are in that solution. So they have to implement bug fixes. They have to implement new features as are needed or required by their testers, right? So they become a developer, so to speak, and it takes away from the testing effort that they're putting into. Secondly, it like I said, it becomes a full development effort, but for the testing team. So the skill set is different, or the requirement is different than a data tester would need. So now you have to have a developer type skill set within the team. And again, it takes away from the testing efforts or capabilities of your team. And if by chance, whoever is developing this homegrown solution decides to move on from the organization, now you have no support, right? Exactly. Who's going to take it on? Who has the in-depth knowledge of, the pitfalls and what have you when developing that particular solution? So, it's not supported by a full organization that this is their business. It's supported by one or two people on your team. And if they leave, you lose that knowledge. Another thing is that typically these homegrown solutions just can't scale, right? They're purpose-built for a particular project or a particular data set or volume of data set that is a known factor. But what happens if another group wants to use this solution, or the same group encounters a different project which a much higher volume of data that's coming through? It's possible that the solution just simply can't handle that amount of data. And that all comes through with the development efforts of understanding, and trying to future-proof your development efforts against it. There's just really no capability of handling higher volumes on these homegrown solutions.
And again, if a new team wants to use it, that sucks up your resources because you have to sink in resources into the development to customize to that new project.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And then I'd say probably one of the other major things is that with these homegrown solutions, they don't maintain historical data. There are a lot of industries that have an auditing or some sort of regulatory mandate, specifically, pharmaceutical industries and banking industries, that they must maintain historical data. And that's part of the development effort. So if you don't have the foresight to build that into the tool, then you could run into some trouble if you are part of one of those organizations.
Good. Now this leads us to the solutions, right? How are people addressing this, or what do you have to look out for in a tool, a commercial tool, that could help you address these issues? Rashad, what are the key factors when determining the solution and strategy behind data testing? Like, how can you implement the tool to that?
Right. So, one of the things we just talked about is the volume of data for homegrown solutions. So one of the things you want for your tool is to be able to validate a large amount of data, data that you are currently working with in your organization, but also future-proofing against the volume of data that is to come. And you want it to be able to validate that data relatively quickly. So you have to have a fully baked solution in order to do that. You want it to be able to implement and validate transformational rules. And some of those transformational rules can be complex. Eric brought out the example of the name column in the source that needs to be split to first name and last name in the target. That is an example of a transformational rule, but these transformational rules can get quite complex, especially when pulling from multiple systems and determining based off of the system and the data within the system, which data to pull. You can have merge and match rules that are determined based off of the data, and they can get quite complex. You want to be able to integrate with external tool sets, right? So we talk about getting into the DevOps or the data ops space, and a key component of that is integration with the external tools that are involved in those DevOps solutions. Things like Jenkins, Electric Cloud, Bamboo, Azure DevOps, those types of solutions you want to be able to integrate with test management solutions that are out in the marketplace, simply because you want to be able to have a full stack and capability of running your tests without having any manual intervention, and having those test results report back to you. You want to be able to detect when there are changes required to your testing code, right? So if data changes or data requirements change, you want to be able to know that your tests also have to change to reflect what those new requirements are. You want to have team communication features, right? So when you run your tests, you want to be able to know, do I have a problem here? And you don't want to have to wade through the application to find where my problems are. You want it to be able to communicate to you that say, hey, we got a problem here. You need to take a look into this, without you having to do that active work of swimming through all of the data that you've tested the night before.
And potentially risking not finding the
and
problem.
not finding the problem at all, right? And
exactly.
then alerting multiple people so that we have multiple eyes on it, possibly developers, testers, business owners. You know, the more people we have looking at this, the more quality we're going to have. And if you can't communicate that, then what's the point, right? So communication features are definitely important when looking for a tool in the space. And then, as I mentioned, you want some historical results. For auditing, like I mentioned before, if you have regulatory mandates, but for analytics, right, you want to analyze your testing results as well. You want to be able to say, is my data getting better over time or is it getting worse over time? And what components of that data are the problematic areas that we need to continue to look in. So I think these are the key items that one would look for in a testing tool, a commercial testing tool, when they're looking to acquire one.
Great. And that brings us to QuerySurge, your solution. See here. Well, I have a really going into use cases, just more anecdotal than anything else. Using QuerySurge and to address these similar issues. We have one of our customers locally here in Montreal, where we've worked quite a few deals with, and they've grown from a few licenses, very few licenses, to a lot of licenses, to going onto an enterprise model. And it's taken time, but going through everything that we've mentioned in the presentation, we slowly guided them towards adding better practices, adding better methodologies, understanding what they have to do with their data, so that they can grow in the space and not only grow with the tool, but grow within the industry with the right practices. Eric, do you have similar cases or similar situations that you've experienced with your customers?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things we should probably do is talk a little bit about how QuerySurge came to be, because it directly ties back to those different methodologies or processes of how people are currently going about data testing. RTTS's service division was engaged in some of these data testing practices. And we started out using, as Rashad mentioned, some of the standard functional test automation tools on the marketplace. And while they were able to get us, part of the way, they would run into issues when we started getting into larger data volumes or needed to do this in mass in a short period of time. And that essentially led to the Homegrown solution, where we started creating our own scripts and started writing our own code to be able to test this data in an efficient manner. And some of our customers saw us starting to develop that, and they said, hey, we have lots of projects where we could apply this to. And the same issue with the Homegrown solution is, at the time, it wasn't really geared for that. It was geared towards a specific project. But what we started to see is enough customers were starting to come up with the same challenges, where we said, you know what, this could really be productized, and we could come up with a solution that could be versatile enough to be able to address all these different challenges that these organizations are running into. And that's kind of the inception of where QuerySurge came from. And again, to address what your question you posed, yes, we see lots of customers with these different use cases, with these similar challenges, and working with SQALogic and our other partners, we're able to showcase the solution and really speed up the testing process, come up with a great automation strategy so that customers can be successful in their data testing effort.
Yeah. Perfect. Rashad, do you want to add anything to that? Do you have a specific story or?
Yeah, I deal as the director of customer support or product support. I deal with a lot of our customers, not necessarily on the partner side. Eric deals with them, but direct customers that we have from a QuerySurge perspective. And there are two that kind of stand out for me. One is a pharmaceutical development company that we worked with. They're not a pharma company themselves, but what they do is they provide the clinical trials or perform the clinical trials for the pharmaceutical companies, which are their customers. So essentially, they're consuming the data from the pharmaceutical companies and going through all of the clinical trial, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 clinical trials, and documenting all of the data from across all of these trials in different parts of the world. So that is a very data-centric activity that is, requires that your data have good quality, and you can validate your data, pulling in from external sources, these customers, these pharmaceutical customers, into your systems, and then going all the way down into the data warehouse and the BI report. So obviously this is for life-saving medication, right? So they're performing clinical trials that have a real impact on life and people in general. And then I would say, from a business intelligence perspective, we have one customer who's a leading cable TV/ISP provider. And what they use QuerySurge to do is to validate the data for their daily campaigns that are generated. So they send out campaigns to customers and prospects on a daily basis. And these tests needs to be executed first thing in the morning, because the decision needs to be made, is the data good for these campaigns going out to our prospects and our customers, or is it no good and we hold back on these campaigns? And so QuerySurge is an integral part in determining whether the data that supports these campaigns is good. And this is a mission critical process for them, because it's a very heavily revenue generated system. So that's, though it's not on the level of saving lives like the pharmaceutical industry, is quite important to this customer of ours, because it is part of their main business source.
And one other use case I'd like to bring up, Albert, is, kind of ties two of the use cases listed here: big data testing and data migration. I was working closely with a financial institution in the UK. And one of the things they were doing is they had mainframe data, and they were looking to move that into a Hadoop file system in the AWS cloud. So they had a couple different challenges in place. One is the data coming from mainframes was in a BSIDIC format, which pretty much the only thing that can read BSIDIC is a mainframe. So we needed to essentially convert that data over from BSIDIC into an ASCII format. One of the benefits is QuerySurge has the ability to, specifically its flat file driver has the ability to call custom functions. So we were taking those BSIDIC files, converting them to ASCII, and then once they were converted, we could take that data and compare it to what was eventually being loaded into the Hadoop file system. And this went from an on-prem mainframe to an AWS cloud storage application. And they said that they had, I think, something in terms of, 200 different data sets, and they were adding like 20 data sets for every sprint that they were doing. So there was just no way they were able to keep that up manually. But with implementation of QuerySurge, they were able to implement it. They started, it took a few months to get going, but once they had it in place, they were able to catch up with each sprint. And they're currently in that last phase, which is, okay, now taking that and integrating it into the data pipelines, where when new data sets come in, it automatically gets triggered to run the automations around it, execute it, and they'll get notified very quickly if there are issues. So just another, I think, use case that touches some of the items listed here. And
that's great, because it ties in perfectly to our next slide, which is the workflow that you just described, the assess, plan, design, execute, and evaluate processes. Could you add some more explanation towards this process, towards the workflow?
Rashad, you want to take that one, or you want me to jump in?
Yeah, why don't you jump in, Eric?
Okay, sure. So, through our experience, we kind of developed a strategy around, the best practices for implementing automation around a data testing process. And it's kind of outlined in these steps here. We've even developed some training materials for people who are looking to QuerySurge that they can leverage to, learn how to plan these projects out. And the first part is assessing, what needs to be tested, how many different data stores are we doing? Where are we going to do in-depth testing? Where would be so much data where we're going to do some sampling? What are the key points? From there, it goes into planning. What are the tests that we need to create? How are we going to execute them? How are we going to go about designing these tests? There you go into the design phase, where you start writing the SQL necessary or creating the test automatically using some of the tools that are within QuerySurge available to you. And then, of course, then it's the execution of those tests, the evaluation of those results, learning what went right, what went wrong, and making an iterative process so that you continue to improve on the automation journey that you've initiated.
So it's always the same steps, but always improving and always evolving.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Which brings us to the next slide. Maybe Rashad can take this one. Would you be able to describe a little bit about the overall process of creating and executing tests in a typical data architecture?
Yeah, sure. So in a typical ETL process, you have different hops or legs, or what we call testing points. And you want to be able to validate data between each of those hops and data testing points. And what you see here is an example of it. You'll have some source systems, and they may be disparate source systems, whether they're databases, they're flat files, they're Excel documents, coming from feeds from XML, web services, REST API, bringing back JSON data. All that data needs to be pulled in. And as you can see, it goes from that source to the big data lake in this graphic that we have here, or it can be any other landing system, where you're kind of just staging the data to be pulled into your data warehouse. And then you'd have a different leg, the leg from that staging area or the big data lake or your NoSQL data store into your data warehouse. And this is where all your fact and dimension tables are going to reside. And then maybe it goes into a data mart. The data mart simply pulls a piece of the data for a particular business process or a business reason that will support your BI, which is the last step here. Your BI and analytics. QuerySurge can test each one of those testing points, right? That's what you want to do. You want to be able to isolate those testing points, because if you have issues or defects that reside in one of those testing points, you want to be able to identify where it is and be able to address it. So you would test essentially between each of your hops or testing points here to be able to identify whatever issues in those testing points. Because if you have an issue, say in testing point 1 here, it's going to cascade into issues in testing points 2, 3, and 4. So you want to catch it before you get the data into those later testing points, so that you know that you have good data going down. And this is where QuerySurge fits in. It gives you the capability to integrate, or it kind of infiltrate your ETL process and say, hey, what does our data look like along the way, rather than just that.
Get that lay of the land of how the data goes from one all the way to your reporting at the end. It's the entire life cycle,
From the beginning to the end, because that is where the introduction of issues can happen, and you want to stay away from that at all costs.
And you were mentioning integration, and what better than Devops, right?
Yeah, sure. So that's the latest thing that we're seeing in the space, is that a lot of people are integrating their data testing into their DevOps workflow. And like I said, we like to call it data ops. And it's basically operational projects where jobs are being triggered automatically, whether they be time-based or whether they be triggered by other systems. And now with QuerySurge, you can integrate the testing as well of your data in your DevOps or data ops workflow. QuerySurge offers several APIs that allow you to do that integration and essentially allow QuerySurge to run your tests without any manual interference or need for people to kick off tests manually, right? So essentially, everything can be done in an automated fashion based off of your custom trigger points, and then allow you to make decisions later on in your workflow based off of the results of your testing that you may find. So if you want to take path A, if you have passing situations, or path B, if you have failing situations, you can do all of that in an automated fashion using the QuerySurge APIs that you can integrate with your current DevOps processes.
Good stuff. So we've talked about how you implemented or how it looks on your environment, but how does it actually work? It's very much a feed in from a the source data, and it's a target source, and it's basically just transforming the information if need be. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the solution itself, Eric?
Sure. So QuerySurge has a concept of a test, which we call a query pair. And when you design this query pair, you're going to specify a source system and a target system. The source and targets, all the connection information needed to establish the connection to those different data stores are set up by the project administrator within QuerySurge, and then they can just be selected for whatever test you're going to create. Once you've established what your source and target are going to be for this query pair, the next step is, how do I pull the data? So we have built-in query wizards that have a UI, which will give you the schema of whatever system you're testing. It'll show the tables and the columns, and it'll show both on the source and the target side. And you could just do a little nice drag and drops to set up the connections of what you want to test. And it will actually build the SQL for you in order to execute those tests. For some organizations, though, they may already have the SQL because maybe they've been doing some of those other processes that we discussed, such as sampling or minus queries. Yep. And they can take that and essentially just take what they've been doing and include it into these query pairs that can then be kicked off, automated, aggregated, stored for the historical data and all those types of items. So that's essentially the key concept. It's creating those query pairs, grouping them together for execution, and then being able to perform analysis on the results that QuerySurge brings back.
Great. And just a little overview of how it meshes into an environment or how it works with the agents and the controllers. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, so QuerySurge is a web application. So the testers themselves are viewing QuerySurge through their browser. QuerySurge itself gets installed on a server, has its own application and database server. And it also has a concept of agents. So for those of you who have done traditional automated performance testing, when you're trying to test a website, you have these different agents, and each agent is pushing load on that system. And then it feeds back the results into the performance tool to get the overall metrics. So QuerySurge works in a somewhat similar way, where our agents are what are used to push the different batches of queries that are running against the various systems. So the more agents you have, the more kind of groups of tests you're able to run in parallel. And those agents will make the requests to the source and target systems, bring that data back, and then enable it to be analyzed by the QuerySurge server.
Yeah, and just to add to that, seeing that QuerySurge does sit in the middle of the environment and there's all these agents touching the customer's data, how concerned are customers about the security around their data with QuerySurge?
Yeah, so I mean, data can be very sensitive, especially depending on the vertical or the industry that you're in, right? So with QuerySurge, we try to implement most of the best practices and try to go above and beyond from a security perspective. So as Eric mentioned, QuerySurge is a web-based application, so all of the implications with that go along with it. So we've implemented the capability to for users to communicate between them and their browser and QuerySurge via SSL and TLS. That's the latest standard communication security protocol. We use JDBC as our connectivity to the different data sources. And that comes with its own implemented security. So you can do things like security, certificate security or key-based security and implement it however your organization requires you to do it. There's also things like Kerberos authentication to the data sources. So if you have your own internal security mechanisms that you use to connect to the data sources, QuerySurge can typically integrate with those security items. We offer you Ldap integration. So instead of just logging into QuerySurge with a QuerySurge-based username and password, we can integrate with your Ldap systems and say, hey, use your network credentials, which offer a lot more security because you can, from an organizational standpoint, require your passwords have a certain complexity, right? So things like that, Ldap integration will allow you to implement that from a QuerySurge perspective. And then there are things like disk level encryption that you can do on the database and the like. And there are a lot more things that are out there. Those are just some of the basic ones that we know off the top and we implement because, again, we know that data is worth its weight in gold. And specifically for certain industries, there are certain security requirements because the data is so sensitive, you know, personal information, PPI is what they call it, and things of that nature. So we implement best practices. We try to go above and beyond, and we're continuing to innovate based off of new security requirements and protocols in the industry to implement them in QuerySurge as well.
Great. That's fantastic information.
And Albert, one last note there is
yeah.
as well is QuerySurge is not a hosted solution. So wherever QuerySurge gets deployed and installed, it's completely within the organization's firewall. They have complete control over it. Nothing ever leaves, whether that's an on-premise or within their virtual private network in the cloud. They own, the environment, the data, and have complete control.
Just to specify, sorry to interrupt, but just to specify two words that it is not a SaaS solution. It could be deployed on the cloud or on-prem, but it is not a SaaS solution.
Yeah,
correct?
I just wanted to say that, QuerySurge from an organizational standpoint, RTTS and QuerySurge, we have no access to your data, and we don't want it, right? Because it's your data. So exactly right. It's not a SaaS solution. It's not a multi-tenant solution. It's in your environment, whether it's on-prem or whether it's in your own cloud.
Excellent. And seeing that we're running low on time here, we've passed already by a minute. Quickly, the advantages. Basically, Eric, what are the benefits of QuerySurge summed up?
Yeah, I'll make it quick. So everything with QuerySurge has automation in mind. So when you're designing these tests, they're used to be grouped into suites that are executed either on demand or scheduled. We have query wizards, which allow you to build anywhere from 75 to 85% of all your tests without having to write any of the SQL. This is great for new projects that maybe not having the SQL in place already. We have over 30 different reports and widgets that are available to display the metrics that we're capturing to make the most sense out of the data that we're testing. And we spoke, in pretty good depth about our API and how we can integrate it into any type of pipeline for continuous testing, continuous delivery, and all these features provide a significant ROI for our customers.
And going towards the ROI bit, Rashad, do you have anything to add to the ROI?
Sure. So anecdotally, obviously what you get out of QuerySurge is the level of coverage that you're going to be able to implement over the other methodologies of testing that we discussed earlier. You're going to be able to find defects that maybe have existed for years that you didn't even know were there, right? And then you're going to get the speed and repeatability of using a fully baked system rather than the other methodologies. Just two examples I'd like to offer. One of our customers, who's an international auto manufacturer, said they created 7,000 tests and were testing hundreds of millions of rows of data. And they realized, based off of their own analysis, is that they received a 1,600% ROI over doing manual testing. And another one of our customers, that's a consulting and analyst organization, essentially said once they've implemented QuerySurge, it took them just 3 test cycles, essentially, to cover itself, for QuerySurge to cover itself based off of manual testing. So imagine if they're doing cycles 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, how much value they're going to see on that. It's a great value add for our customers that we've seen time and time again.
Absolutely. And this brings me to the customer experience. So basically, in partnership with QuerySurge, SQALogic does offer training, support, and sales towards the product. We do have the RTTS certified documentation for the training, on-site or online platforms for the training as well. We can also offer the training in French for our local Quebec, Montreal area customers. So that is not an issue. When it comes to the support, we're there along the way of the installation, troubleshooting, using the tool itself, and incident management. So in any problems that you have, we can guide you. We can be on your side with every single step of the way of the incident. When it comes to the sales part, Eric and I, we can help assist the organization in sizing the requirements. How much do you need? What bundle is right for you? Is it a right fit, or do you have to look for something else? Those are all questions that we can help you with. Renewals, if ever you do have renewals of the product through another partner, we can assist you with that as well. And any new features that are coming out, we're like any other partners, we're privy to that information, so we can easily host one-on-ones with the customers and let them know what's coming out and what the roadmap looks like for the product. So feel free to reach out to us on those bits. Eric, do you want to add anything to those?
Yeah, just to say, data testing itself, as you could see through some of the discussion today, is complex. There's a lot of things that go into it. Implementing QuerySurge, I think from a usability standpoint, QuerySurge is pretty straightforward, but it touches a lot of technologies. You're connecting to multiple data stores. There's integrations into pipelines. And for that reason, we rely heavily on partners like SQALogic to be able to provide that guidance to the customers where they can, show them the proper approaches to get where they want to go from. So maybe from having, just manual testing to have automated testing that's kicked off automatically through a pipeline. SQALogic has been instrumental with some of our customers, and we look to them for that type of guidance to get customers where they want to go with QuerySurge.
Thank you on that. For anybody interested in looking at the product or having an actual POC, please feel free to contact myself, Eric, or both, and we'll gladly reserve some time with our representatives. Now, Q&A part. This is where the audience gets to ask questions and we can see if we can answer a few of them as quickly as possible. We have gone over by a few minutes, so we can take 1 or 2 questions, and questions are open. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, if you guys have anything to throw in as an additional bit of information, feel free.
The only thing I'll mention is for those who are interested in QuerySurge, you can go to our website at QuerySurge.com. You'll see lots of information there regarding the use cases that the tool addresses. We have white papers, case studies. You have the ability to trial the software if you want to kick the tires with it to see how it works. So definitely recommend you to go to QuerySurge.com and check it out if you think there's an interest where it could help your organization.
Great. There is a question that just came in. If my complex TSQL ETL, which transforms data from source to target, example, multiple joins, aggregations, lookups, has been verified, can such test code be included in a QuerySurge run?
Yeah, I'll field that question. Absolutely. You simply would just need to pull that code in to the query pair that we're discussing. That's the main testing asset. And essentially, in those query pairs, you're implementing SQL to run against the data that you're looking to transform. So if you have this code that's already generated in an external system, we have capabilities to import that data from a QuerySurge perspective, or you can just do simply a copy and paste into the test that you're creating. And then you can run the test in QuerySurge. And again, QuerySurge will give you the repeatability and the automatability rather than running them from some sort of SQL analyzer tool. So it's an easy transition if you already have the query that you're looking to execute, whether it's a straight pull or as complex as you just described with joins and the like. It's not a problem for QuerySurge. It's very easy to transition.
Great. And I believe that's the only question that came in. And to wrap it up, Eric, I believe there are trial licenses that people can ask for if ever they need them.
Yeah, so if you go to the QuerySurge.com website, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a green try it free button. You can click on there. There's several different options. There's one option where it'll just give you a cloud install, and you just get a URL where you can try it out for a few days. If you want to test it with your own data, you can download a trial, install it, and every download comes with a 15-day trial license for you to kind of explore. Allows you to go through the QuerySurge tutorial and get a feel for how the product works.
Fantastic. Guys, it's been great. This was a great webinar, a lot of information to assimilate for the viewers. The video will be up on YouTube. So if ever you guys missed anything, feel free to look it up, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Rashad.
Thank you, everyone.
For the invitation.
Thanks, Albert.
Take care, Rashad.
Take care.
Take care.